Welcome to lesson 2, where we're going to explore taking what Steve outlined as an introduction to purple teaming in lesson 1 and actually put that onto paper as a plan that we can actually start to build on and get ready to execute. In this lesson, exactly as I said, we're going to take a look at actually translating the objectives and ideas of a purple team event and figuring out, how are we actually going to deliver that? What do we need to do? What's everyone's responsibilities? And most importantly, how do we actually see, recognize, and capture that value and deliver it back to our business? So, as Steve outlined, we don't just start purple teaming. We don't just, jump into a room and start doing things. We really need to understand the bigger picture of why are we here? What are we trying to solve? Purple teaming, like most things in this industry, isn't going to solve every problem. It's not going to be something that we can just, do once, invest in, do a whole huge gathering and cross it off our list and move on to the next big problem. That said, it's as we described, it's an iterative approach to really taking an informed understanding of what our threats are, and over time, whether it's one day a week, one day a month, one day a year, injecting that value back into our organization. But really, that's only possible if we understand those objectives and continually over time grooming. Why are we here? What are we trying to prove? And what's that next step we're going to take to actually improve and really inject that value back into our business? So, this is one of my favorite slides personally. I could stare at the matrix all day, but as Steve outlined earlier, we can't purple team all of attack. That's just not a reality. It's also something we might not want. As we talked about, there's going to be techniques here that aren't relevant to your environment. Maybe they aren't prioritized. Maybe you just aren't ready for that yet. They're not relative to things that you are particularly good at right now, and maybe it's a goal later on. But really, what we want to do with this purple team experiment is understand how do we optimize what we're good at and what we're best at right now. Let's exploit our benefits and our strengths and figure out, as we're understanding and exploiting these benefits and these strengths, understand where we need to pick up new skills and slowly over time kind of grow that defense to where we want to be. So, a couple ideas of how do we actually see an objective and start to understand, you know, if we're going to purple team tomorrow or next week, what should we actually target? There's a couple, and I think Steve outlined this really great in the last lesson, but we can start asking ourselves questions in terms of, what could happen to us? What would happen to us? What has happened to us? And that might outline a more tangible and realistic scope that we can use to maybe understand, like I said before, exactly what steps we're going to take and what do we actually want to learn about. Another approach is, and I love the way Steve highlighted this earlier, is gaps. Where do we need to improve? Maybe agnostic of any type of external um, idea, we can start to look at internally, what do we know about our systems? What do we know about our processes? What do we know about our people? Are there things that we've been sweeping under a rug or we've been avoiding for years? Purple teaming is an excellent medicine for actually starting to open that up and decompose that problem. We're not, and as I said before, we're not going to solve it immediately, but we can start to at least appreciate the problem for more than just a monster in our closet that we're just, going to hide from and not ever try to fix. And finally, it wouldn't be anything for MITRE ingenuity if we didn't talk about threat intelligence. So, let's take a step back and think threat informed defense. What are our threats telling us about the things that we should be caring about? And that in itself might highlight, even if it's down to one technique or one step technique or even one procedure, that might help us see through the noise and actually see ourselves in attack and figure out, hey, maybe our purple team scope is one simple idea. Let's get really good at defending that one idea and move on to the next one. So, as we kind of explored, and we're going to keep foot stomping this point, purple teaming isn't just red versus blue. It's a community event and it takes many perspectives. And all of those perspectives not only shed a really important part in defining objectives, but also kind of play a bigger role throughout the entire process. So, not only in planning and execution, documentation, follow up, we really need to make sure that we're appreciating all of the different objectives that go into this and are capturing those and actually managing those throughout the entire process. And this is something that, I think as we've explored before, working through these previous events, working with Steve, that's something it sounds good on paper, but it's really funny when you see these events kind of materialize in terms of, how many people are working on these same problems. And we've never been in the same room. We've never talked about things. I've never understood how a blue teamer looks at an analytic. I've never written, this query that we're dumping into a seam and running across 10,000 hosts. Those are just experiences and perspectives that I don't think you'll see from a red side unless you're actually stepping to that boat. And I know Steve has stories on the other end of, hey, this is, red team experience of we see an idea, we see a problem. We're on Stack Overflow, copy and pasting code. We're in GitHub trying to find tools. That exact, we don't need to fully understand everything that goes into the other side, but we can start to define these are where we meet in the middle. We have very similar problems as defenders in this same ecosystem of trying to solve these same problems. But where can we actually overlap? Where can we learn from each other? And where can we actually, start to provide value to each other? So, bigger picture also is, as I said before, we don't want to just purple team for the sake of purple teaming, just to check the box and say, we did that thing, it went well. But so what? So, we really need to make sure that we are not only purple teaming with an objective, but we actually can translate that objective back to the bigger picture of not only did we do this event and we answered these questions, we asked the right questions, but also, how do we actually translate that back to something that could make our next purple team more nuanced, solving a more mature problem, or in any way, push the envelope in the right direction? So really, this starts, especially at the planning phase, with understanding an objective. What question do we need to ask? What question do we need to explore? And that really will set I guess the roadmap for the rest of the purple team. Is now we can all agree as stakeholders all at the table, see a shared problem and understand that together we are trying to better answer this problem. And then, as I said before, we might all go off in our different directions and act on that in a different way. But most importantly, we can collectively agree that we're not just doing this, we're doing this collectively together towards a very clear and, attainable goal. So, this is something that resonates with me very heavily, but purple teams aren't built in a day. It's not something that we can just do, in the next hour, in the next day. You can definitely take some shortcuts and maybe find ways to optimize that planning process, but you can't expect to just put the right people in a room and start purple teaming. And that starts with, not just, the objective definition, but there's also a lot of infrastructure. There's a lot of resources, whether it's red team tools, blue team analytics, blue team wisdom. In general, that expands out to other stakeholders, whether you're talking about compliance folks or hardening people, architecture. Really, when we're planning and defining these purple teams, we need to make sure that stakeholders can see themselves, whether we're doing this in prod or, as Steve mentioned before, we build a synthetic environment. They need to be able to see themselves in this event to really actually be able to kind of take that data that's being generated and translate that back into their understanding. So it really is important as we're planning this to not only define these goals, define these stakeholders, but really make sure groom their perspective into the infrastructure and confirm that they can actually see themselves and have the capability to, while we're executing, actually start to tease value out of it.
Yeah, Jamie. So one example of this would be that multiple times as we have set up purple teams, we've got some behavior that we're looking to explore, better detection analytic for. And we get into the purple team and maybe one of the participants has a new idea and they want to try it out, but the environment is not collecting the logs required to test their idea. So that goes to this planning piece, the importance of really trying to think through, like, what are people going to be trying to do during the purple team? And have we instrumented the environment sufficiently to let them explore lots of different options? Not just the thing we think they're going to try or the thing that we think is the quote right answer as we're planning it, but the point of this is to let people explore the space. And so having instrumentation there is really useful. Working with the adversary emulators to help them prepare for implementing it in lots of different ways and thinking through, okay, what are the different components that of this technique that I could modify and still stay within the scope of the technique, still stay within the scope of the threat intel, and are there modifications that need to be made for the environment that we're in, and can we do that in a way that's still true to the threat intel? Because that could be a slippery slope. So there's a lot of thinking that has to go into it ahead of time to make sure that the environment is ready to really make it a sandbox for the purple teamers to play in.
And I love that point. And one of the things that we haven't explicitly said yet is exactly what you kind of highlighted here is it's purple teaming isn't just a show up and everything's going to work. The word we're dancing around is, tabletop. A lot of this can be ironed out by just having the right conversations, exactly as you said. We don't need to actually, start putting hands on keyboard to start answering all those questions. So a lot of this process and a lot of this planning process is really just having conversations and really making sure, hey, you have a vision of what you think this is. Do I actually understand what that, is? And have I done everything to help you kind of connect what we're doing to your vision? And that's a perfect segue. As you said, we need to treat this as an experiment where we are thinking about what are our controls, where are we trying to learn, and what do we need to maintain as consistent so that we can learn from that constant. But also, how do we capture creativity and innovation that is not only impactful but also relative towards our bigger objective? So as you can say, I'm a big fan of a purple team approach. Really, very often, the control or the objectives are going to be focused on that red perspective. So red team coming in can't just get hands on keyboard and start doing whatever's fun or whatever feels right. We really need to, from that threat informed mindset, start to define, understand what do we actually need our red team to do? What do we need it to look like? And as you said before, Daniel, I love the iterative nature of purple teaming. I'm going to need you to do it more than once. You can't just do something and just start typing keystrokes. And if I need you to do it an hour later, if I'm testing an analytic based on what you just did, I need to see it again. I need it very constant. So we can treat that red teaming as a constant where we can see and understand what we are trying to actually purple team around. What are we trying to build from? And where are those actual points where we're trying to learn? Where can we grow? But also, most importantly, as we start to understand and start to fill in those gaps, give the red team the creative freedom to, hey, let's present, here's how we're actually defending this point. Maybe we have a prototype or we have a hypothesis of how we're answering those questions. give you a little freedom to say, what do you think about it? Challenge us. Is there something we missed? Is there an analytic that we didn't consider? But exactly to your point, it's all kind of building on that central idea, that central objective that we defined. We're not going to go off into in a rabbit hole and chasing something down. We're kind of centering and revolving around a nucleus idea that still has that value added back to all the stakeholders.
Yeah, one good example of this was when we do scheduled task as the behavior that we're looking for. A lot of times the hypothesis starts out as if someone's going to maliciously schedule a task, then they'll run tasks at the command line. That will generate a process creation event for 688 or sysmon1. And I will look in there for, that tasks was the executable. Maybe I'll look for some command line arguments. And so that might be the first run through, right? The red line there would be executing task scheduling from the command line using tasks as we're expecting. And that first blue question mark might be that process creation approach. And maybe now we've got the shield because, yeah, we are successfully detecting that. But then, then we have Daniel do it via API call directly, and there is no tasks process creation. And we've bypassed the analytic, and that is really valuable for the defenders to understand. Okay, there was a way to evade that approach, and now we've got a new blue question mark. And so we're thinking, okay, well, now how will we detect that alternative approach? We usually end up using event 4698, which gets triggered either way, and kind of ends up having a more robust defense than we would have if we weren't giving the red team the freedom to flex and push that envelope.
And that brings up a really good point is, the red team response would be, I could pick a different technique. Maybe I'm doing WMI event subscription, or I'm doing registry run keys. And those are really good points to bring out in terms of maybe a next iteration. But I don't, Daniel, I don't really think it'd be appropriate to start executing different techniques when we have, as Steve defined, a very clear objective of let's understand scheduled task. We're here to explore that rabbit hole and take the depth of that sub technique versus, doing credential dumping and lateral movement and really just kind of losing control of the event.
Yeah, I think that factors in well with the purpose-driven idea of a purple team. Like, okay, the purpose of this was about, in that case, scheduled tasks, not all these other behaviors. But it also ties into what we're going to talk about in lesson 4 with follow-up. So let's document those other things. Maybe we've uncovered that we've got a really good defense against this one behavior, but we know that if the adversary did these other things, now we're vulnerable there, and we need to explore that in maybe a future purple team, or maybe we need to do some more research.
Yeah, and a lot of these variants, the creativity aspect, and it can even be done beforehand too. With a lot of the planning that goes before actually executing the purple team event. The adversary emulators can already take these ideas into account, knowing that there are multiple ways to execute a technique. There's going to be multiple procedures, and each of them will cause different telemetry, can be detected in different ways, all within the same technique or sub technique. And so they can purposefully craft their TTPs so that when called on during the iterative phases, they can throw in, oh, I'm going to do API calls instead of directly calling tasks. But they'll have those prepared ahead of time. So a lot of that can be done early on, and that way people aren't scrambling trying to develop on the fly during the purple team event, which could happen sometimes. But obviously, the more prepared you are beforehand, the better.
So I'm looking at you for this one, Daniel, but I know you've heard this. This is for a tangible example of how we, exactly as Daniel said, come to, at least from the red perspective, show up to the table is we have this saying internally is trust the script. As a red teamer coming into a purple team, we've already built out a plan. We've defined that solid red line that we're going to follow. And, at this point, it's copy and paste. Something like this, a great example that we've used from evaluations is we're able to, we can red team on demand. Tell me what part of the emulation you want. It's really just as simple as, we've built the code, we built the commands. We're just trusting the script, copy and pasting it, turning my brain off. But exactly as you said, Daniel, we are sitting, watching, learning, looking for those opportunities to innovate in terms of, I understand. I've already understood the script. I can share it. I can describe it. I trust, and I also understand the script, and I want to see a different perspective on it. What does Blue see in the script? Are there things about the script we could change? Are there things that we could do better? Are there things that maybe we need to try it a different way and maybe water it down a little bit and kind of take a step back on that maturity curve? But all of this is really only possible if we show it up to the table with a plan, if we have a script to trust. And then, bigger picture here is now that we're doing all these technical activities, we're really starting to think about how we're getting in the weeds. We can't lose sight of that bigger picture of what are our objectives? Why are we actually here? But most importantly, from that introduction and that planning phase, we can start to understand where we are today and where we need to be, but also map out that path. And understanding, let's chunk this out and say, we're not gonna, as I said before, we're not gonna purple team once and check it off a list and really take that huge leap of, innovation in all these different aspects. We really need to understand and be able to pinpoint those exact steps that we need to take, but also, relative to our organization, is this something that we can do in a year, something 6 months? How do we reassess that over time and make sure, as new threats come out, as new technologies are introduced in our environment, that we're actually evolving and keeping up with this? So, going back to art, as we very often do in cyber and infosec, is, let's take lessons and say, Van Gogh has an amazing quote here of great things are not done by impulse, but a series of small things brought together. And I really think and hope that captures a lot of what we're describing with the purple teaming of, there's so much wisdom and perspective swirling around this event. Exactly as Steve's going to capture in lesson 4 with follow up, that's only possible if we've actually planned and documented. And you're not just going to show up to an event and hope everyone takes good notes, compile that into a huge stack of paper and hope you can find the magic in there. We need to plan ahead of time and say, let's take our objectives, translate that to formats that we can actually use to capture notes during the event and make sure when we get to that follow up that we have all the data that we need.
Yeah, this is a really tough one for the people, the main audience of this course, right? The people who are going to run the purple team and plan out the purple team. This is a lot of work because you don't necessarily know ahead of time what is going to be needed in the moment during the purple team, what events the defenders are going to be looking for, or what the adversary emulation team is going to need to be able to do. It'd be great if you could just have like a wide open sysmon config and a GPO that collected all events, but that's going to fill up your hard drive in like, very short order. And your SIEM's not going to be able to handle it. So you're going to have to be smart about which events you're going to collect, what kind of network traffic you need to collect, and make sure that you are balancing the performance concerns of not collecting too much with collecting enough that you're giving your participants the space to explore.
That's a really good point. Like this can be very, very difficult and very, very, something that changes over time. But I'm a big fan of start small. Keep it simple. Let's build a structure that captures what we could need, and over time, as we iterate, whether it's during the event, between events, over time, we can start to carve off, what kind of blueprint, what type of data structure actually makes sense for us in terms of capturing and taking notes. It's a really, really rudimentary example here of something that we've actually used in the past is This could be a simple sheet that every participant has of, what do we execute? In terms of now that we have this plan, we have this script that we can trust, we can actually document and use ATT&CK to define what are we actually testing here in terms of our objectives translated to tangible red team actions. What did we expect? In this case, we're talking about clicking a malicious payload. Coming into the event, our expectation is that shouldn't be possible, whether we're detecting it or blocking macros, or we have this control, or we expect that this is going to work. Whatever that is, let's define and document our expectation so that we can actually start, as the event's being executed, have a plan of let's see and get confirmation of things we're doing well or things we need to improve. We can only really appreciate that if we have that full kind of picture outlined. And funny story, if this structure looks familiar, not an accident. We actually have used that in products such as attack evaluations. It's a little bit more nuanced, but you can kind of see the direct connection with this very simple approach can evolve into many different shapes that help us answer many different problems. So in conclusion, that was a really fun lesson. I had a great time. We should definitely do it again. But quick summary, biggest point of planning is that we can actually take those objectives that we define from those various stakeholders and actually start to scope and actually start to think about, when we execute this, what do we need to do? And that's not just putting hands on keyboard. That's taking notes. That's making sure everyone is involved, everyone has their role, and they actually understand not only their role, but their role in servicing others in this event. Most importantly, at the end of the day, that we can all walk away and see exactly as the big point of this, the defensive value and the defensive improvements that we can bring back to our organization.